Thanks. Okay, it's time for us to begin. If you will, come on in and we'll get started. We're going to continue in the book of Acts. We got a little more than halfway through with Acts chapter 9 last week. Of course, the all-important conversion of Saul when he was on the road to Damascus and he was blinded and told to go into the city and be told by Ananias what to do. And of course, he obeyed. And so we see the conversion of Saul there at the beginning of Acts chapter 9. I do want to point out that at the very beginning of Acts chapter 9, please notice that the text says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord." And then in the very last verse that was covered last week, notice the change. So the church, in verse 31 of 9, "So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up." Isn't it amazing what the effect of the conversion of one person can do for the church? I have to ask myself, has my conversion been that big of an effect on the church as it was for Saul? I think all of us need to think about that. And so we see the all-important conversion of Saul. Now, Luke had pointed our attention to Saul just for a moment. The early chapters of the book of Acts were really focused a lot on Peter, a couple other disciples, Philip, Stephen, people like that. But for the most part, we've been looking at Peter a good bit. And now we're going to get back to focusing on Peter for the next few chapters. And then in chapter 12, he kind of goes off the scene, and then we get back to Paul. And so Luke is going to point us back towards Peter and his actions here while serving as an apostle for Jesus. So let's pick up reading there in Acts chapter 9, verse 32. Now as Peter went here and there, that's probably a reference to verse 31, the areas of Judea and Galilee and Samaria. As Peter went here and there among them all, he came down also to the saints who lived at Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, bedridden for 8 years, who was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed." And immediately he rose. And all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Well, I'm reminded of what Peter is doing here. It seems to me that he's going throughout all the regions in that area surrounding Palestine and places like that. And it seems to me that not only is he trying to continue to convert people to Christ, but it seems that he is looking to encourage people who had already been converted. He looks for the saints, and he finds some at Lydda. I'm reminded of the end of the book of John. What did Jesus tell Peter to do? 3 times. Feed my sheep. And so it appears to me that that's what Peter is trying to do. He's trying to fulfill his responsibility that the Lord gave him to take care of the flock, to do what he can to encourage the saints. And so when he comes to this little area of Lydda, he finds among the saints a man named Aeneas. Now, significantly, this is a Greek name, and so most likely he was a Hellenist, similar to the ones that we read about in Acts chapter 6. And this man had been paralyzed. We don't know how he was paralyzed. We don't know to what extent. Was it from the neck down, waist down? We don't know. But we know it had been that way for about 8 years. And so imagine the state that this man would have been in. His muscles would have atrophied. He would have been very weak physically. And then all of a sudden, Peter comes along and he meets him. And Peter says, "Jesus Christ heals you." Notice, Peter didn't say, "I heal you." Who heals you? Jesus Christ heals you. And immediately, the text says, immediately, Aeneas stood up and made his bed. Now, as impressive as that is, and I don't want to make light of that, what's the climax of that event, though? At verse 35, "And all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord." What was the result? Many people were converted to the cause of Christ. And so again, we see really the purpose of the miracles. We see that they were not meant to just help people. What were they meant to do? They were meant to point people to Jesus. And that's what we see what happened with Peter here. He healed Aeneas. Everybody saw him, and what did Peter do? Peter ended up taking their attention away from him to the Lord. And we see many people were converted to the Lord here in Lydda and Sharon. Now going on in verse 36. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. So Tabitha would have been her Hebrew name. That's the way her name is in Hebrew. And so Dr. Luke tells us it's translated into Greek, Dorcas. And so Tabitha is Hebrew, Dorcas is Greek. Can anybody tell me in here what that name means? Little gazelle, that's right. And so it was a Hebrew practice actually in ancient times. Parents would name their little girls based off of beautiful animals. And so Tabitha is little gazelle. And so, of course, we don't know what she was like physically. I don't know if she was elegant, like a gazelle. I don't know. But what I do know, certainly her heart was beautiful. Notice how the text describes her. She was full of good works and acts of charity. The original language tells us that it was constant. This lady constantly served others. She was constantly full of good works. There's not much we know about Dorcas, but what I do want us to observe, turn over to the book of 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 2. I don't have this in your notes. Starting in verse 9, Paul, the apostle, says, likewise, also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. And so it seems to me that Tabitha here is really paving the way for the description of a godly woman that Paul would later describe to Timothy. I am so thankful for the women that I know in my life, particularly, of course, my mother, my grandmother. Of course, I'm married to one who fit this bill. They're not worried about the outward appearance that Paul was describing there in 1 Timothy 2. What are they most concerned about? The inside, being full of good works. And so we see Tabitha is certainly a great example of that. This is the type of woman that I want my daughter to know about. This is the type of woman that I want my sons to look for to marry. This is the type of woman that every woman needs to look to. And so we see that she is a great example. Verse 37, in those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Now, what was the typical time frame for burial in that part of the world? Same day, right? Most of the time, when somebody died, they were going to be buried that same day. Now, what did these disciples do? They washed her, and then what? They didn't bury her, did they? They laid her in an upper room. Hold on to that. Since Lydda, verse 38, was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, please come to us without delay. So not only did the disciples wash her body and lay her body in the upper room, they also fetched for Peter and told him to come quickly. Now, I don't know if this is true, but I think, I am wondering at least, if these disciples had an inkling that Peter could raise her from the dead. Normally they would have buried their dead, right? But they didn't do that. And then further, what did they do? They called for Peter, please come quickly. And so no doubt this at least suggests the idea that these disciples had faith that Peter could raise Dorcas from the dead. Verse 39, so Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. So the text tells us in the original language that she had made inner and outer garments for these widows, And it also suggests that these were the actual garments that they were wearing while they were standing there. And so imagine them standing there weeping and telling Peter, she made this very shirt for me, right? She made this jacket for me. And so it adds just a little bit of personal touch to it, I guess, if you will. And so Peter arrives, he goes to the upper room, and he sees the widows that Dorcas had helped there weeping there. Verse 40, but Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. Now, up until this point, we have no information of an apostle raising someone from the dead. This is the first time, at least according to the record, that this has occurred. So I ask you, how did Peter know how to do that? Turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 5. We're going to be familiar with this. This is going to be the account when Jairus comes and he is seeking the help of... Am I in the right place? There it is, yep. So Jairus comes and he's seeking the help of Christ. Why? His daughter is very ill, right? And so he finds the Lord and he says, please come and help my daughter. And on the way, Christ is stopped by other people that need his help, right? And so Christ, of course, being the all-compassionate Lord that he is, he helps them too. And so during that meantime, a servant from Jairus' household comes and finds them and says, no need to come. The child has already died. So let's pick up reading about verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Notice what Jesus does. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. What did Peter do? Peter arrived in the room and he put everyone outside. Who is he following? He's doing exactly what the Lord did. Keep going. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Here is another parallel to what Peter did. If you take what he said to Tabitha, arise, there is one letter difference between what Peter said and what Jesus said. Peter said, little girl, arise in Aramaic. Peter said, little gazelle, arise. And so again, we see Peter basically doing exactly what Jesus did. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Now here's one difference. Look at verse 43 of Mark chapter 5. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, by the time that we get to the book of Acts, what's the biggest difference? Peter brought in all the saints and all the widows and made sure that everyone heard about what he had done through the power of Jesus. And notice, again, what is the climax of this event? Verse 42, and it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. So again, we see the purpose of the miracles were to point people towards Jesus. Now, significantly, before we get into chapter 10, Peter stays at the house of a man named Simon, who was a tanner. He was a leather worker. This was considered an unclean position, ritually speaking. So by Peter staying at this man's house, he would have been considered ritually unclean. Of course, this is kind of preparing us for the events that are going to happen now in Acts chapter 10. So, as we get into Acts chapter 10, I don't know if we can overstate the importance of this chapter and what happens here. You and I are sitting here this day able to be a part of the body of Christ because of the events that happen in Acts chapter 10. And so I think all of us should pay very close attention to what happens here in this chapter. So, Acts chapter 10, verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort. Now, a centurion was basically a commander, if you will, and he was in charge of how many soldiers? Centa. How many? 100, right. And a cohort usually would have been a group of soldiers anywhere from 600 to 1,000. And so he was a part of this Italian cohort. They were from Italy, and he was in charge of 100 different men. Notice how the text continues to describe him in verse 2. A devout man who feared God with all his household, he gave alms generously to the people and prayed continually to God. The text paints Cornelius, the centurion, in a very good light. As a matter of fact, there are, I think, 5 or 6 other centurions that we read about in the New Testament, all of which are painted in good light. But I think Cornelius stands above the rest. The first way that he is described is he is a devout man. We have seen this word once before. Can anybody tell me where? In the book of Acts. What kind of people were gathered there in Acts chapter 2? Devout people from all the nations. And so God used devout people in Acts chapter 2 to begin the church, and now He's going to use a devout person to bring the Gentiles into the church. And then he's described as a man who feared God. Now this is, of course, the idea of a respectful fear, somebody who had great awe and reverence for God, but it's also a descriptive of a type of a person during this time. So basically you had Jews and Gentiles, and in between them, sometimes you had a Gentile that converted to Judaism. They were called what? Proselyte. Imagine if you have a Gentile who observes a lot of the customs of the Jews, who believes in the one true God, but has not been converted all the way to Judaism. Guess what they were called? God-fearers. And so we see that Cornelius is a God-fearer. He believes in the one true God. He does a lot of the things. He worships God. He prays to God. All these different things, but he had not been proselyted yet. And so this is the type of person that we are talking about here. Notice that he feared God with who? With all of his household. Our dads in here, all of us need to underline that. He was a great dad. It was not just him that worshiped God and prayed to God. Who else was it? It was all of his household. Then notice he gave alms generously to the people. He was a generous man that helped not just Gentiles, but he also helped Jews. We'll see that later. And he prayed continually to God. Now in verse 3, we see about one of these times that he was praying. Verse 3, it says, about the 9th hour of the day, which was when? About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which significantly that was an hour of prayer under the Jewish system. And so you see again that he is observing some of the customs of the Jews. He is in an hour of prayer. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, Cornelius. This was no mistaking. How did he see it? It was clear, right? It was clearly a vision. And so the angel addresses him by name, Cornelius. Verse 4, and he stared at him in terror and said, what is it, Lord? I do not think that Cornelius understood that he was necessarily speaking to God through an angel or to Jesus through an angel. When he says, what is it, Lord, that could have been just a respectful way of addressing the angel. It would have been us like saying, what is it, sir? Okay? Continuing on in verse 4, and he said to him, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. I find that very interesting, the way that the angel describes the way that God had heard the prayers and alms of Cornelius. He says they had ascended as a memorial before God. It's certainly language that is used in the Old Testament to speak of the sacrifices, right? The incense arose into heaven, and it was received as a memorial, right? And so, in a sense, the angel is almost suggesting to Cornelius that his prayers and alms had somewhat had an effect on God, almost. They had been received by God, and he had heard them, and he is ready to act on behalf of those prayers. As a matter of fact, when you jump down to verse 31 of chapter 10, Cornelius is describing what happens to Peter. He says, Cornelius, he's talking about what the angel said, your prayer has been heard and your alms have been remembered before God. Now, I have a question for you. What does it mean when God remembers in Scripture? God doesn't remember in the sense that I remember where my keys are, right? It's not that God forgets anything, okay? We need to always understand that. When the Scripture tells us that God remembers something, it was not that He forgot whatever it is that He's remembering, okay? Go back to Noah on the ark in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. What was it that God remembered? He remembered Noah, and it meant what? It was time for the waters to subside. In other words, when God remembers in Scripture, it means it's time for Him to act. What is God going to be acting upon here? It's time for people other than the Jews to be a part of His body. And so we see, maybe in some respect, that Cornelius' prayers had had an effect on God. And I find that very interesting. Verse 5, the angel continues, and now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called two of his servants and a devout soldier, there's that word again, from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. Please notice that Cornelius was a devout man, and he taught his household, and what was the result? He had devout people that he could depend on. If I want my kids to be devout, what do I have to be? I have to be devout. And so we see Cornelius again setting a good example for those around him. So he obeys right away. He calls people and he's going to send them to Joppa to fetch Peter. Now verse 9, the next day, as they, that being the people that Cornelius was sending to Peter, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. Now when is the 6th hour? Noon. Significantly, another hour of prayer for the Jews. And he became hungry, verse 10, and wanted something to eat, but while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. I want to pause just a moment, and I want us to appreciate something. This great event in the history of all mankind, certainly within the church, God enacted, He came to people that were praying. What was Cornelius doing when the vision came to him? He was praying. What was Peter doing when he saw the heavens open up? He was praying. I wonder how much more God could do through you and me if we prayed like we should. Now, of course, I'm really thinking about myself. You may be a very fervent prayer. I don't know. But what I do know is that I can improve my prayer life. We see that God chose to come to people in prayer to effect His will of this great significant event. And so I think that's something that should give us pause and cause us to look at ourselves and make sure that we are going to God in prayer like we should. And so Peter saw, he fell into a trance and he saw the heavens open and something like a big sheet descending that was being held up by its four corners. Verse 12, in it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. Verse 14, but Peter said, By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And so now we know that the animals that were being brought down on that sheet were, at least under the Jewish law, under the law of Moses, would have been considered unclean to consume. And so the voice that is in the trance tells Peter, Rise, kill and eat. And what does Peter say? Nope, not going to do it. By no means. This is not the first time that Peter has disagreed with a command, is it? You remember, at least the Lord told him what? Before the rooster crows, what are you going to do? You're going to deny me. And what did Peter say? No, I am not. I am willing to die with you. Who was right? Of course, the Lord was. And so Peter, again, here is disagreeing with the Lord. He says, I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. Verse 15, and the voice came to him again a second time. What God has made clean, do not call common. Of course, in the immediate text, that can be applied to the animals that Peter is seeing that is being told to consume. And that would be appropriate and it would be applicable. What has ended? The law. And so by that reasoning, Peter is able to consume these things, right? God had ended the law when he nailed Jesus to the cross. But, of course, we will see later on that Peter, of course, inferred what was being taught here to also apply to what? To people. What God has made, do not call common or unclean. Now, I want us to think about me and you. We don't have a problem with Jew and Gentile, do we, today? What do we have a problem with sometimes? Well, let's be honest. Our world has struggled with race at some points in time, hasn't it? Did God make the races? Yes, He did. And so I do not have any right to call any person common or unclean based off of what? Skin color. I don't really have a problem with that, to be honest with you. At least I don't think I do. I don't really struggle with that at all. I will tell you what I do struggle with. You know what I struggle with is sometimes when people think differently than I do. You see, there are a lot of people in this world that are saying crazy, crazy things right now. Guess what? God made them. God made them. He stamped them with His image. I cannot call them common or unclean. In other words, they have just as much right to hear the gospel as somebody who I agree with and love and want to see in heaven. You have people who don't claim to not understand the difference between a man and a woman. There's no such thing, right? How crazy is the world that we're living in? But guess what? As crazy as that person may be, guess what? I need to do all that I can to try to teach them the gospel. Why? Because God made them, and He stamped them with His image. I do not have a right to say, nope, I'm not even going to try. And so I don't know, maybe you're not like me, but I tend to struggle with that. People that think differently than I do. Guess what? They're not common and unclean. God made them. Verse 16, this happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up once to heaven. I find it very interesting that Peter had to be told 3 times what to do. This is not the first time that he's had to be told 3 times what to do. You go back to John 21, and we already mentioned it. What did Jesus say 3 times? Feed my sheep. Cornelius had to be told 1 time what to do, and he did it. Peter, the apostle, had to be told 3 times. I wonder, and this is just me thinking, are there people in the world that are more ready to obey the gospel than I am to tell them about it? Peter had to be told 3 times. Cornelius, the sinner, the person outside of a relationship with Christ, was ready to do it on command. How many people are out there right now that are just waiting to be told what to do? How many times is God going to have to tell me, go tell them about me? We don't need to wait around. We need to be told. We need to be telling people what needs to be done. Verse 17, now while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry for Simon's house, stood at the gate. So Peter was inwardly perplexed. That is quite strong language. It even can carry the idea of being confused or even agitated, not quite agreeing with what he had heard. And so we see Peter, he's struggling with this. This was a huge change for the Apostle Peter. We need to appreciate that. This was something that he actually continued to struggle with. When you look over in Galatians chapter 2, why did Paul get in Peter's face? He was a hypocrite. He was okay with eating with the Gentiles for a little while until what? Other Jews came along, and then what happened? He withdrew himself from fellowshipping with the Gentiles. And so Paul got in his face and told him that that's not the way it should do. And so this was a huge change for not just Peter, but all the Jews. And so he would have been inwardly perplexed. He would have been wondering, what does this mean? What is the significance of this? And of course, you got to appreciate God's timing. Peter is wondering what's going on, and then what happens at the gate? The men that Cornelius had sent show up, and they're looking for Peter. Verse 18, and they called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. And while Peter was pondering the vision, there you have the idea again, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Rise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. And Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming? And they said, Cornelius, a centurion, an upright. Now we have a new characteristic of Cornelius. He is upright. This word carries the idea of being just, and so he's a fair man. That's a rarity for a Roman commander, isn't it? And so again, we see the great character that Cornelius was. He's upright and a God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. That word for directed there, other translations have warned. The idea is that he was divinely directed. And so it suggests the idea that Cornelius understood that what he was doing was sending for someone who was going to tell them what God wanted him to do. And so he's divinely warned, and he's told to send for Peter to come to his house and to listen, to hear what you have to say. Now, this was probably mentioned in Acts chapter 9 with Paul being on the road to Damascus. An angel has already appeared to Cornelius and told him, this is what you need to do. Why did he not tell him what he needed to do to be saved? Did the angel know what Cornelius needed to do to be saved? I think that probably stands to reason, yes. So why didn't he tell Cornelius what to do? What is God's design for people to be saved? Men to tell other men what to do. You go back to Paul on the road to Damascus. He's talking with the Lord himself. Why didn't the Lord tell him what to do to be saved? That's not within God's plan. He told him to go into the city and listen to Ananias, another man. And so again, we see God's plan. If people are going to be saved, it's because we are going to tell them about it. God's not going to come to them in a vision and tell them what to do. If people are going to be accepted into heaven on judgment, it's because we are going to tell them what to do. And so, the next day, continuing on in verse 23, so he invited them in to be his guest. The next day he rose and went away with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa accompanied him. So, Peter is going back. He's going to Cornelius' household with the men who Cornelius had sent. as well as some of the Jewish brethren with him. Verse 24, and on the following day they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. Remember what I just said. Cornelius was divinely warned. He knew that what he was going to be told was something from God that he was going to need to do. So what was the natural reaction for Cornelius? I need to get people that I care about here. I need to tell my friends, and I need to tell my family. Y'all need to come and listen to this. This is going to be important. We need to be like Cornelius. How many of us invite people that we care about to come and study the book? Doesn't have to be here. It'd be a great place to do it. But how many do we invite over to our house? Let's have a meal and let's study God's Word. Cornelius understood the importance of this, and therefore, it wasn't just for him. It was all his household and his family and friends. And so he invited them over. Verse 25, when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. So, a couple of things stand out about Cornelius' expectation. One, we just mentioned it, that he understood the importance of it, so he invited people that he cared about to be with him. But then when he saw Peter, what did he do? He fell down and worshipped him. Now notice what Peter says here. But Peter, verse 26, lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." Significantly, there are two things that stand out to me. Number one, Peter did not accept worship because Peter is not divine. He understood that worship is really only intended to be for God. And so he didn't allow Cornelius to worship him. But number two, how did Peter see himself in relation to Cornelius? As equal. What did he say? I too am a man. So, despite Peter really kind of struggling with this idea, we see him beginning to at least accept this idea and understand what is being initiated by God. He says, so stand up, I too am a man. Verse 27, and as he talked with him, he went in and found many persons gathered. And he said to them, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation, but God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Now, can anyone tell me where the law is under the Mosaic system that says a Jew cannot be with a Gentile? Well, yeah, you can't intermarry. But this, what Peter is talking about, there is actually no law for that. And so we see a little bit of what the Jews had done. They had kind of made their own customs and traditions here. Of course, there were purity laws that told them not to eat with Gentiles and things like that so that they could remain ritually clean for their ceremonies and things like that. And so there is some of that, but it appears that the Jews had kind of extrapolated what God said in the law and made a little more out of it than what it actually was intended for. Of course, this would not be the first example of that. The Jews did a lot of that. But there is actually no law that says that you cannot associate with another, or visit anyone from another nation. But Peter says, but God has shown me. That word shown means that he had proved, or he had explained to Peter that he should not call any person common or unclean, as we mentioned just a moment ago. Verse 29, so when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then why you sent for me. Verse 30, and Cornelius said, 4 days ago, about this hour, I was praying. See, there we have it. At the beginning of the chapter, we kind of assumed that Cornelius was praying. But he flat out tells us he was praying. I was praying in my house about the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing and said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa, and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging in the house of Simon, a tanner by the sea. So I sent for you at once, and you have been kind enough to come. Now therefore, we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. The last verse that I want us to think about this morning is there in verse 33 at the end of the verse when Cornelius says, "Now therefore we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord." I find it significant that Cornelius was that aware of what was happening when Peter came to his house. Notice a couple of things that Cornelius stresses. Number one, he knows that they are in the presence of God. And so, where two or more are gathered in the name, God is there, right? And so Peter was there, and he was going to explain to Cornelius about what he needed to do to be saved. And Cornelius recognized that they were all there in the presence of God. But also notice that Cornelius recognized the authority of the Lord. He says, we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. Cornelius understood that Peter and he himself were to do things according to what God wanted them to do. And then, of course, notice that he and his associates have an obligation to listen to what Peter had to say. He says, we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded. And so Cornelius sets a great example for you and I. He knew what was going to be said was of vital importance, not only to himself, but people that he cared about. And so he invited them to come, and he told Peter, we are here now to listen to what you have to say. Next week, we're going to stop right here. Next week, we're going to start with Peter's sermon there, starting in verse 34. We're going to finish chapter 10, and we're going to get into chapter 11.